Georgism claims that land is a big deal. But is that still true in the modern economy? Joining the podcast for the second episode in a two-part series on Georgism and land value taxes is Lars Doucet. Lars is the co-founder of Value Base and author of the book Land is a Big Deal, and he joins the show to discuss why he believes implementing land value taxes is a good idea. We discuss the theory behind why land matters, how land appraisal works in practice, how zoning interacts with land value taxes, and the politics behind actually getting a land value tax passed. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please like, subscribe, and all of those good things. If you really enjoy the podcast, you can support us by going to patreon.com/Neoliberal Podcast. You can also support the podcast by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can become a member at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Members and supporters get benefits like access to our community Slack and bonus episodes. Thank you for all of your support, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guest today is Lars Doucet. Lars, welcome to the show.
Pleased to be here, Jeremiah.
All right, so we've done this in a previous episode. We had part one of kind of our little series on Georgism and land value taxes, and that episode was much more focused on philosophy and Henry George's life and the history of the movement and stuff. And I'm really looking forward to getting into kind of the nitty-gritty, kind of getting into whether or not land value taxes really work. And if they do work, how are we going to implement them? So I guess from a 10,000-foot view, can you give me the case for why we should be implementing land value taxes?
Yeah, why we should be implementing land value taxes is pretty simple, actually. Is that governments need revenue, but that's always fundamentally in tension with the fact that it feels really intuitive that people should be able to keep what they earn, right? And we have just accepted this kind of status quo compromise that we need to tax people's labor and we need to tax people's capital, that is to say their investments, things they've built, tools, etc. And just kind of sitting here in the middle is this entire class of people who passively extract value out of the rest of us. And Georgism says that is the thing we should be taxing. We should be taxing the unproductive activities that basically are a drain on our economy. And those things are not just land, but also any land-like asset, which includes monopolies and natural resources. So Georgists believe that we should tax land, natural resources, and monopolies, and ideally nothing else. So we would replace income taxes and sales taxes and capital or investment taxes with taxes on land, natural resources, and monopoly. And the reason you should do this is that it's economically more efficient, it's also more morally just, and it's also more practical. Because if you want to tax wealth, well, there's some arguments for doing that, but the problem is that wealth tends to run away and hide in the Caymans and in Swiss bank accounts. And if you tax income and labor, you get less labor. And if you tax capital and investment, you get less capital and investment. But if you tax land, well, you don't get any less land because it's not like there's a bunch of land fairies making a bunch of land each year, And when you think about who is collecting resources from holding land, it's an unproductive class of people who are essentially levying a private tax on everybody else, which just is kind of a drain on the economy. And so instead of just allowing an entire class of people to be like noble gentry, just extracting wealth out of people and not contributing back, we just replace that private taxation with public taxation and then reduce the public taxation accordingly. And then this sets up a positive flywheel where we reinvest that taxation into public goods, and those public goods cause common prosperity to go up. Basically, you can sum up Georgism in kind of the phrase, tax what you take from society, not what you make from society, right? If you're taking something that should belong to the commons, either by getting yourself a monopoly grant or giving yourself the right to tax other people privately, we think that is where basically taxes should come from, rather than from people's labor, from people's capital.
It's interesting you brought up both the moral argument and the efficiency argument, because I see both of them, and I think it's very interesting that some Georgists, they emphasize one or the other. Some people are, purely in an economic model. There's no deadweight loss from taxing land because you can't get less land. The land is always going to be there. And so they use this very economic efficiency style reasoning. And then some people go more all in on, land is unjust. You haven't earned your land in the way that you earned, say, improvements to the land. You built a building, and that's fine. You deserve credit for that. Your labor is something you deserve, but nobody really earns land. I almost feel like that, that hippie guy who owns a dog, and he's like, well, nobody really owns a dog. Nobody really owns land. But there's kind of a morality argument in there, too.
Right. And so, this is where we kind of run up against intuitions, right? Because, I'm a landowner. I own a house out in the suburbs. So I'm not here to make some kind of communist argument that we're all going to live on some hippie commune and deprive everyone of, their right to control territory. Because when Georgists say, we have an issue with, land ownership, what we really have an issue with is land as an investment, right? We've got this kind of crisis right now with housing, because housing is both shelter, but it's also an investment. The difference between us and communists or Marxists is that Marxists want to do away with private control of land as well as private ownership of it, right? They want not only for people not to be able to profit from land, but they also don't want individuals to be controlling what's done with it. They want the state to basically be centrally planning the economy. And Georgists have a horror of central planning. We still think people should be making individual decisions with what's done with land. You can still own title to land. We just think you shouldn't be able to leverage that to extract wealth out of the rest of the community for value you didn't create. And that's kind of a nuanced difference, and we can get into it. But basically, it's okay to be a landowner, but it's not really okay to be a land speculator or a pure landlord or someone who is profiting from land as an investment, essentially, is our argument. But other forms of profit we're totally okay with, and we think are good for society.
So you wrote a book called Land is a Big Deal, and I'm going to ask you, is land even really that big a deal anymore? And I'm sure you have some very good answers for this. I don't think you title your book that without having a good answer. But I'll make the basic case, and then you can respond to it. When I think about the past and the economy the way it used to function 100 years ago or 200 years ago, I think most of the power was definitely in land, in that, the big landowning estates. I think about literally the British gentry who owned 99% of the British countryside. And I think about big, agricultural sectors where, most of the economy back then was still agricultural and very, very much tied to the land. But when I think about, the economy today, I think about the very richest, most powerful people, none of them really got what they got from land. Mark Zuckerberg did not get rich off of land, nor Bill Gates or Elon Musk or any of these types. And so it makes me wonder, have we shifted to a space where land is not as important as it used to be?
Well, what's interesting is, the answer is that land is still very much a big deal. And to understand the nuances of this question, what you're really getting at, and this is a very common thing that people bring up, is that society used to be agricultural. And so people therefore make the assumption that land's power only comes from agriculture. So as agriculture wanes, now that we've mechanized agriculture and gotten really good at making a lot of food without a lot of people being tied up with it, and food has become this fairly cheap commodity, land isn't really all that important anymore. And, now we have things like...
Just to go on a sidebar, It's always fun for me to share with people like stats about how much money people used to spend on food like 100 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
People don't realize it used to be like a third of your income would go to just feeding your family.
Or
whereas
just
today it's like at like 4% typically or something like that.
Or just like put it in terms of hours and number of people working in the agricultural sector, right? It used to be approximately everybody, and now it's approximately nobody, proportionately compared to how it used to be. Right. And so obviously back then, if you owned all the land that people need for food, obviously you are now the king. Right. But land has shifted in a couple of ways today. And you brought up a couple of things. Bill Gates and all the other billionaires didn't make their money from, being agricultural magnates to, we no longer live in an agricultural economy. Right. And I'll bring up some other issues. Right. We have things like, the metaverse and the internet and all these things. It feels like we live very virtual lives where we're kind of disconnected from the physical. But when you scratch the surface, you realize that land is almost more powerful than it's ever been. First of all, the first transition that happened was the Industrial Revolution. And what the Industrial Revolution did is agricultural land became less valuable after we mechanized agriculture, but other land became more valuable. It just shifted which land was more valuable. And the land that was more valuable after that revolution was land in urban centers, in cities, because people piled out of rural areas and into cities. And so it's not like land is all of equal value, right? Nowadays, it's not like, you just measure land by the pound or by the acre, and that's how wealthy everyone is. It really depends on which land it is, or as the real estate agents say, location, location, location. And Manhattan is exponentially more valuable than Nebraska, right? And so in Henry George's time,
you could actually measure that empirically. Like the actual value of all real estate in Manhattan is literally more than the entire state of Nebraska, and probably many other states. Yeah,
by a lot. Yeah. Oh, and by not a small amount either. And the thing is that why is it valuable, right? Well, you need to realize all the things that land sort of encodes, right? It's more valuable to be in a dense network of people. And that dense network of people is something that depends on all those people being in the same place. And so imagine the simple example I like to make is you have a hot dog stand and you want to sell as many hot dogs as possible. And you have the option of setting up your hot dog stand in a field in Nebraska or a desert in Nevada or in Times Square. Where are you going to sell more hot dogs? Well, clearly in Times Square. Now you could come with the same amount of hard work, your awesomeness as a hot dog seller, and the same amount of capital, which is, hot dogs and the latest hot dog technology, and the freshest and most amazing condiments.
Now I'm wondering what the latest hot dog technology is, by the way.
Yeah, me too. I'm sure there's plenty of surprises in store for us. But yeah, but the hot dog cart itself is technology, right? And all kinds of heating and refrigeration equipment and all that. But what's really going to determine how many hot dogs you sell is not how much labor you have or how skilled your labor is or how much capital you have and how sophisticated your capital is, but where you are selling those hot dogs, right? And you are going to sell so many more if you're set up in Times Square than if you were in the middle of the Nevada desert, because there's more people there. There's more hungry people coming out of work. You're going to be, that's just such a great location. And so the fundamental insight of Georgism is that if you want access to those prime locations, you need to pay someone to access it. And so pretty much the entire full value of that location is going to be demanded from you from the person who owns that location. And that premium is what we call land rent. And it is this huge, huge portion of the economy. A lot of people estimate it's about a third of the economy goes to land rents. And the thing about these land rents is it's why you also can't afford to live in Manhattan. Right? Because location. Why are people willing to pay so much rent in Manhattan? It's because there's all these great jobs. Why are there all these great jobs? Because there's all these people, there's all this technology, there's all this infrastructure, there's all this public spending, there's all of these things that make Manhattan valuable. And so the landlord basically has this ability to increase the rents based on how much more productive the area is. And they didn't necessarily create that productivity. Like, yes, if they improve their own unit that they built through an investment of labor and capital, surely they can increase the rent a little. But most of the rent is because of the land rent, the locational premium. And that value is created entirely by the rest of Manhattan and the rest of the neighbors, all the people there who are providing all the community value. And that is mostly going to private taxation and is not the result of anything that a particular landlord contributed in terms of investment or in terms of labor. And so to answer your question, it's like, that's why urban land values now are where most land value is concentrated, right? But to get back to your question, it's like billionaires didn't make their money, through owning land, right? Well, this is where we get to the notion of, well, what do we mean by land? When Henry George was talking about land, he generally meant three things, right? In this kind of annoying way that 19th century economists use terms kind of confusingly. He meant literal land, and he also meant natural resources. But he also made a case for monopoly privileges, right? And so I would argue that essentially these are not all exactly the same thing, but they do have some very strong things in common. And they're basically all ways to make wealth off of other people's efforts. And if I had articulated the answer to your question earlier better, like, what is Georgism in a nutshell in just one sentence? It's this. Everyone's entitled to the fruits of their own labor, but nobody is entitled to the fruits of somebody else's labor, right? And the three kind of ways you can do that is, if you own land, you can charge people for living in an area through the value created by the community that increases the demand for land that you have now gatekept. And when you own land, the chief measure of what you are providing is not what you're providing, but what you are excluding. You put up a gate around it and you don't let people use it, and you invoke the monopoly of the state to kick someone off of it. Basically, when you're a landlord, the service you're providing is your privilege to call the cops and kick people off of land you've paid for. If you are providing capital or if you're providing labor, you're actually bringing something to bear for society. With natural resources, and I'm talking about, things that pre-exist us, you're kind of doing the same thing, and then the only difference there is that, those things can be used up, whereas land typically can't be. And then we have monopoly privileges. This is things like copyright. This is things like patents. This is things like, but even more to the point, it's things like actual classic monopolies. Like, I go and I petition the government to be the only one who's allowed to distribute this and such product. A good example would be marijuana is being legalized in a lot of places, and something you're seeing a lot of is, I think it was like John Boehner, like former Speaker of the House or whatever, is like suddenly gotten into like legalizing marijuana in a lot of places. But you'll notice that when they're making this case, they're like, now we got to be careful about it. We got to make sure that only a couple of companies are allowed to have special licenses to do it, because you can't go too crazy and just let everybody do it, because then we wouldn't make monopoly profits, And that's kind of the thing there, is that those classic monopolies are a way that a lot of your billionaires make a lot of money. And then to push back on the question that, the point where it's like, yeah, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates didn't, make all their money in land, but they certainly are among America's biggest landowners now. Bill Gates has famously been buying up tons of American farmland. What is the actual amount of land that Bezos owns? Yeah. Bill Gates is number 49 in top landowners. He's number 1 in terms of private farmland, but number 49 in terms of overall land. Jeff Bezos is number 25, and Ted Turner is number 4. So let's not imagine that rich people don't own a lot of land, because they actually own most of it.
Fair enough. And there's a fun stat. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but did you know that New York City actually does license hot dog vendors by location? There are some hot dog vendors that only have to pay like $700 a year for their license, because they're licensed to a specific spot. There are other locations that pay around $300,000 for their license because they are in like a prime spot in Central Park.
That seems like it makes a lot of sense. And I don't know a lot about the New York hot dog licensing scheme. So there's ways to do that poorly and ways to do that well, but it seems like they've at least cottoned on to the basic principle of that, because otherwise what you would have is just like, people muscling each other out for territory, or you would have people buying a license 70 years ago, like a taxi medallion, and like basically have this rent-seeking hot dog license fiefdom that they pass on to their son and their grandson and whatever,
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's a hot dog mob somewhere, but I do want to get into the point that the economy is no longer centered around agricultural land,
for sure,
but urban land has never been more important.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about urban land and the problems of pricing and housing in urban areas and how expensive it is, the thing that I think about immediately is zoning. And part of me just wants to say, well, look, housing prices are high. If the big crisis is housing prices, they're high because of zoning-induced shortages, not necessarily because of land rents per se. And then, I think if we have a land value tax, but we don't fix our zoning system, is it even going to make a difference? We're not producing any more housing, will it even help anyone?
Right. Well, so I'm a YIMBY as much as anyone else. And so for anyone who doesn't know what that term means, YIMBY means yes in my backyard. It's a counter to, a NIMBY, no and not in my backyard, the people who oppose building more housing. And so I fully agree and support that we need to build more housing and that we need to engage in widespread zoning reform. And I'm actually of the position that neither YIMBYism nor Georgism are sufficient by themselves to tackle the housing crisis. I think you fully need both. And I can explain why. I think either of them is going to be insufficient. The reason that YIMBYism is good and we should do it. And I would, settle for only YIMBYism rather than neither YIMBYism nor Georgism, much as I would settle for only Georgism rather than neither YIMBYism nor Georgism. But let's go through real quick why either is insufficient by itself. And there's this great article written by Stephen Hoskins called Land and Liberty to Build, which goes into why. If you only do the YIMBY stuff, what basically happens when you do all your upzoning is that you will create massive, massive windfalls for landowners, right? Because one of the things that affects land value is what you're legally allowed to do with that land. And so if you just do a bunch of upzoning, you're going to create these massive windfalls for the people who own the land. And NIMBYs actually use this as an attack on YIMBYs to say it's like, oh, you're just a developer shill. You just want to like massively increase the value of their land overnight. And then this kind of sets up some incentives where if there's not this impetus to build immediately, a lot of people are going to, start moving into land banking and wait for upzonings and stuff. And so there's actually this incentive now to come in and buy land, get it upzoned, flip it for a huge amount of money, or and then hold it out of use, right? And then the other issue is I'm from Texas. I grew up in Conroe.
Can I push right there?
Go for it.
I'm curious what you think the incentive to hold it out of use is, because obviously, one of the central tenets here is that urban land values have gone up over time, and it certainly makes sense to speculate in them if you think they're going to continue to go up. But even while you're speculating, there's no reason that a properly incentivized landowner wouldn't be building housing on that land at the same time that they're holding on to it, as long as they're allowed to, as long as the zoning regime says that they can.
Well, right. And so I would point to, just the empirics of how many parking lots there are downtown in Houston to kind of like counteract this. And in many other cities, you can just measure just the amount of parking lots, surface parking lots that are everywhere. And this has to do with our existing property tax regime. Now, certainly more people will build under YIMBYism than without it, right? And so by all means, do as much YIMBY as you can. Don't wait for Georgism to do the YIMBYism. Like, please do the upzoning. I don't care if someone gets a little bit of a windfall. But it's just to remark that you're not going to solve the entire problem. And you're not going to solve the problem of land appreciation that will over time still drive rents upwards. Because what's going to happen is you're still going to have developers who are timing the market, right? They're going to be like, well, it's like I could do the development now, but, it would really, I need to wait until the market is ripe, and trust me, I know what I'm doing. And then also under an existing property tax regime, you're actually actively penalized for building, right? Because the property tax taxes the value of the building as well as the value of the structure. And so that means that if you're holding onto prime downtown land and it's been upzoned, right? The schmuck next door who invests in a high rise for housing or business or whatever is going to increase the value of your land because they're increasing, they're bringing more people downtown, right? And if you're just holding onto a parking lot, your land values are going up just because other people are building. And so you don't need to build now. You can wait. And besides, you're going to be tax advantaged if you don't build, right? And so what a land value tax does is, besides the no deadweight loss arguments, is that it basically makes the correct time to build right now, not in the future, but right now. And it also offsets the effects of sprawl, which is something we can get into.
I'm glad you brought up property taxes, because one of the questions that I had planned to ask a little bit later was, what about property taxes? A property tax is a tax that taxes both the value of the underlying land and the property on the land, the building or improvements or whatever. And I guess my question here is a property tax good enough? Because a property tax is kind of like a land value tax. It's obviously not exactly the same, but does it matter enough in the real world whether or not we're taxing the land itself or just the property overall? Is it really a big distortion, or is this one of those things where, taxing property is actually almost just as good?
It's okay. So like property taxes are probably the least worst of our existing taxes, right? So I would rather live in a high property tax regime like Texas, as long as you had low other taxes, right? I think that's actually probably one of the best ways, short of the best tax, which is a land value tax and a tax on monopolies and externalities and other rent-seeking behavior. I would much rather live in a state with a high property tax and low or no state income and sales tax, because that is going to have the lowest taxes on labor and investment and capital. So people are going to want, so people are able to keep more of the fruits of their own work. And then at the same time, like, property tax is a partial land value tax. Now, it's not perfect and it does have really meaningful distortions, but it's less worse than the distortions of income and sales. But it does have distortions. Let's go into those. So the first is that property tax, even though a large portion of it, as land becomes an increasingly large portion of the value of real estate, most of the property tax might eventually fall on land. The problem is that it distorts incentives at the point of decision making. Like, should I build or not? The person who doesn't build is always advantaged over the person who builds, because the person who doesn't build has the opportunity to free ride off of the increased community value in land values that are created every time someone else builds. And the person who builds always pays more taxes than the person who doesn't build in the same location, right? Land value tax flips that. It makes it so that you are not taxed for building, so you have every incentive to build as much as you're legally able to. And then if you're just holding and you're not doing anything with it, you are literally being taxed on the value that you are literally trying to rent seek. So you might as well throw it on the market, and more supply on the market will presumably lower the prices of those things. And then also, like, it creates this hot potato effect. It's like, it's a use it or lose it fee, essentially. If you're not using this asset, get off of it, right? And
can I ask you like an expansion point on that?
Sure.
Because, and one of the things I want to do, by the way, is I'd love to get into some of the technical details of how we actually implement land value taxes. You've written a lovely theoretical book, mm-hmm. but I know you also are helping, run a startup that is in the weeds of how do we actually implement this. So we're going to get into particulars in a second, but I have like one or two more theoretical questions.
Go for it.
And you mentioned that use it or lose it aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, like, do you just bite the bullet here on the old grandma scenario? Or you could call this like Carl from Up. If the listeners aren't familiar, Up is this lovely Pixar movie with a startlingly sad first 5 minutes that's beautiful and sad, and you should go watch it. It's a great movie. But one of the features of the movie is that it features an old guy who lives on a single-family house in, like, the middle of a downtown kind of area. And it's almost comically like, you know, here's his house, and there's, like, a bunch of skyscrapers around him. And one of the things people say is that if you implement a land value tax like this, it's going to kick people like this character off their land. This is just an old guy who's lived there forever, and he's all of a sudden going to get hit with some incredibly punishing tax for, you know, his property. And so I guess, is there something that you would say, well, that's not actually going to happen, or there's a way we can fix that? Or do you just kind of bite the bullet and say, well, yeah, that's going to happen, but in the end, it'll be better for everybody?
Right. Well, the first thing I will say is that if we're concerned about old people, you know, nice old people being kicked out of their homes, that's a thing that happens already. But we only seem to have any sympathy for them when they're landowners, right? You know, nobody sheds a tear for all the old people who are tenants who are kicked out of their homes by their private landlords and are just kicked out on the streets in much larger numbers than old people who are sitting on $1 million homes in the middle of cities who have to downsize, you know, take their cash windfall and move somewhere cheaper. You know what I mean? Like, nobody cares about those people. And I think, you know, probably we should. But I will say that it's like, okay, you know, it is a political problem if you are the party of let's kick grandma out of her home, regardless of, you know, whether she's, you know, rich or not, or sitting on $1 million home or not. You know, it is a legitimate issue. And there's a very reasonable compromise we made here. It takes you away from like pure theoretical super Georgism, but it's like a perfectly legitimate, reasonable bit of political horse trading to just be like, look, if you're old and you're sitting on some super valuable property, just don't pay taxes for the rest of your life, you know? And when you die or when you move or when your estate inherits the property, they'll pay the taxes. So Carl from Up can stay in his house for the rest of his life. And if he sells it or he dies or he moves, there'll be a lien attached to the house and the next owner can pay off the taxes. And that kind of solves the problem. You know, you pick some fixed age and threshold to apply it to, you know, and just like those people just don't have to worry about it. The problem will solve itself eventually in terms of the taxation. And we don't have to have this horrible optics of sending the sheriff after 65-year-old retirees and kicking them out of their expensive homes. Like, there's just not enough of those that we really need to just be complete assholes about it, you know, and we can just like, you know, do a little political horse trading to make it work.
Yeah, but it's more entertaining if we're kind of assholes about it. If we just say, yeah, screw Carl, you know.
Yeah. Well, what's really...
I mean, when you say screw Carl, it's what you're really saying is he would be forced to sell and he would probably make $10 million from that sale. And so, you know, boo-hoo. To some extent. I get that there's emotional baggage to blah, 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 but let's not, he's sitting on an incredibly valuable piece of property, so I think he'll be okay.
I've even had some friends point out that Up is kind of George's propaganda because Carl was not actually attached to the location so much as to that physical house. And what does he do? He attaches a bunch of balloons and physically moves the house, right? So he's actually able to keep what he actually wants. But that's kind of an irrelevant detail.
That's blowing my mind right now, actually. So, but it does bring up a good point, because you started to bring politics into this. And we've been talking about theory, and we've been talking about economics, and kind of where does wealth come from. But politics always plays a part in this. And I'm curious, what do you think the political barriers are to actually implementing a land value tax? Because there are some places in the world that have done this, but not that many. It's certainly not a common tax around the world in the way that like an income tax or a sales tax is very, very common everywhere.
Right.
So let's just restrict ourselves to America, I guess. But what are the political barriers to actually making a land value tax happen? Why hasn't it happened? And what do you think is stopping it from happening right now?
Yeah, those are two different questions. Like, basically, why did Georgism become go from being a mega popular philosophy to an obscure one? and why hasn't it been implemented as ubiquitously as other policies? And then what are the barriers to implementing it now? And so those two questions, I'll answer them each in turn. So the first one is that the urgency went away from Georgism because of America's relationship with its succession of frontiers. And this is worth, I could do a whole podcast just on this topic. But basically, I have to sum up, like, America is a country with a real frontier mentality, right? Especially in states like Texas. But even if you're from, super urban New York, like, America is still, Statue of Liberty and all that is still, like, seen as this nation of opportunity. And that part of that promise has always been that it's the new world, it's the new frontier. And what do I mean by a frontier? Well, quite literally, a frontier is a land of opportunity. And I mean that like fairly literally, like land, opportunity. It means that there is cheap land that is productive. And crucially, the productivity of that land has not yet been fully priced in. That is what a frontier means, is that there is land you can go and you can work, and you will not be forced to pay all the extra benefits of that productivity just for the privilege of working it, which is what the case was in Europe if you were a peasant, right? And so all the peasants of Europe come to America, from whether it's from Minnesota or Croatia or Russia or whatever. And, there's several phases of frontiers in America. The first is, the original Eastern Seaboard, right? And we can kind of expand that into Western expansion and taking land away from the Indians and all of that good stuff, and all the things that came with that and all the consequences. And so for the people who got the upside of that equation, it was very, very good. And for the people who got the downside, namely the Indians, it was very, very bad. But the point is that you had land where the productivity wasn't priced in. You could go to the Willamette Valley, you could get land, you could farm it, you could be a free person, you could get your own homestead, right? But eventually that frontier closed. And now if you wanted to go and buy, especially if you want to go and buy some of that real estate today, you'll pay full price, right? And so then we got into the late 1800s and the frontier had now closed. And this is when Henry George was doing his writing. And there was a reason he became so mega popular at the time, is because the rent was too damn high. The rent was going up and up and up and up. Industrialization was happening. People were moving into cities. And you would have to pay like exorbitant rents because you needed to live close enough to your job that you literally need to live in walking distance. And so you had these crowded tenements. You're paying, you were going into the factories to work. It was dangerous work. You were getting paid, but then most of your pay was going to pay your slumlord landlord who was managing your horrible tenement building, right? So you were stuck in poverty. And then we suddenly, everything changed. And what changed was that we built the automobile and other forms of transportation, that basically pushed that frontier out again. It opened up a new frontier where it's like, oh, now I don't need to live right next to the factory. I can live in the suburbs. And so now basically those suburbs are a form of productive land in the sense that you can have access to a productive job, but there's way more land available, so the leverage of your landlord evaporates. And so you can own your own home or you can rent for really cheap, and your rent is not going to basically be a significant fraction of your salary anymore, so you can keep more of your salary, right? And so this second frontier opening up, basically lasted for, better part of the 20th century. And then also during the 20th century, we had World War I, World War II, the rise of communism, the rise of neoclassical economics, and then basically all of economics just became this completely bipolar world of, well, are you a capitalist or are you a communist? And that's all there is. You even had Georgists being arrested for being suspected of being communists, even though Marx and George were kind of huge rivals, who were constantly dissing each other, and so everything was just rounded off. Are you socialist or not? Right. And so that kind of sucked up all the oxygen. And then the urgency of Georgism went away because we kicked the can down the road with sprawl, the opening of the second frontier. But now the second frontier has closed. Even though we are still sprawling and we still have suburban development, there's only so far away from town you can go before the value of that is fully priced in.
So if that's the scenario right now, then what's stopping us from making this happen? Is there a particular political coalition? Do you view this as a right-left thing, or as a particular class of interests that might be standing in the way?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the interest that stands in the way is landowners, right? And it's the oldest conflict in human history. You have to realize is the landed versus the unlanded, right? It is. Why is Russia at war with Ukraine? Because they want the land, right? That is like the answer to almost any question about war. Is it about politics? Is it about religion? Is it about, this is about that? It's like even World War II. Why is Hitler, invading this or that country? It's like he wants the land. He wants the land for his people rather than the people that are there. So he wants to kill all the people who are there and replace them with his people and take their land, right? And it goes back to ancient times. And so So basically, the deal is that it's not quite as simple as it's just like, homeowners exist. And that's why we can't have nice things. I mean, I'm a homeowner, right? Am I part of the problem? What I think is happening now is, first of all, one of the obstacles was awareness that this was even an option, right? That's quickly coming back and people are becoming aware that it's an option. Now that the urgency is back and that the housing crisis is now like a top issue on people's minds, especially young people, we can go into the other political barriers. And the other political barriers are things like, we'll talk about homeownership, right? Is that America has this kind of fixed toolbox of solutions, right? We have an issue with supply, first of all, right? And our chosen solution is usually to subsidize demand rather than to increase supply, right? So you'll see
Don't I know it, man? It drives me crazy, but I think you're correct.
Yeah, you'll see places like in California where like, how do we solve the housing crisis? Could we build more houses? No. What if we give people money to buy houses? Well, what do you think is going to happen if you just give people money to buy a fixed in supply asset? Like all you're doing is just giving money to existing landlords, right? And so there's that issue. The other one is just that the older generation, I feel like, really doesn't understand this issue, because for them, they got this really nice period of frontier expansion, right? With the automobile, all the boomers in Congress don't understand what the problem is, because for them, housing was much cheaper when they bought in. And so they're still indexed off of this notion that it's like, well, you just work hard and then you can afford 2 cars and a house when you're 25, right? And other obstacles I would probably put down to our economic theories are kind of not quite up to the task. Our intuitions are not quite there. And then everything getting rounded off to either being capitalist or communist. People are always trying to like probe us Georgists. It's like, well, are you... Like the Marxists are always like, you're just capitalists in disguise. You're just capitalist shills. And then all the right wingers are like, oh, well, you're just obviously communists. And the answer is we're neither, because classical and neoclassical capitalists and doctrinaire Marxists are both committing the same error, which is that they think that there's only 2 things in the economy, labor and capital. And they treat land and natural resources as capital. Whereas Georgists treat them as land, and that's a separate thing that behaves differently. And so from one lens, we're going to look more like socialists, and from another lens, we're going to look more like capitalists, but we're not either of them. We're some completely third thing. And so I would say probably the political barriers include, on the national level, just all national politics is just stuck in gridlock, run completely by old people and just kind of cursed. And then, you have a lot of powerful landed gentry, frankly, that don't want this to happen. But I'm hopeful. I see a lot of hope, not just from young people, but from I think there's a way to pitch this to the left. I think there's a way to pitch this to the right. And I definitely think there's a path forward by focusing aggressively on the local level of government and just applying to real kind of common sense centrist politics and just finding common ground with civil servants and citizens alike.
Yeah. It's funny, when I talked with Chris England last week, he noted that, a lot of Georgists' success in the original wave of Georgism in like the 1900s, 1910s, and so on, came from not theory, not like we convinced everyone and this theoretical argument is so beautiful that we just swept into power, but kind of the nitty gritty of, well, let's just get somebody who understands our idea to be the county tax assessor, and we'll kind of like make it happen on an administrative level rather than, winning elections based on Georgism. And so that's where I want to transition to, how do we actually do this? Because one of the, I think, more serious criticisms of Georgism is that it's great in theory and that the theory is all correct, but that actually assessing the value of land is far more difficult than Georgists believe. And I know this is part of what you're working on with value base. So I guess without getting too crazy fine detailed, can we talk about how do we actually determine the value of land? Because it seems like a really, really monstrously hard problem from the perspective of, like, if you want to have a national land value tax, you're going to have to come up with, like, the air quotes true value of every plot of land in the United States. And you're going to have to do that without considering the building that it's on. And that it seems like a really hard technical problem. So kind of from a high level, for people who aren't familiar with this, how do you propose to do that?
Right. And first, I want to acknowledge that is one of the best criticisms of Georgism, frankly. Right. Let's go over why people have that criticism. First is from a technical aspect. It just sounds hard. Right. Second is because they're worried about political chicanery. So even if people admit that it's possible to do technically wise, they're worried that it gives government too much wiggle room to basically be like, to basically be sneaky in either direction, right? Either to undermine the policy by being like, oh yeah, like, okay, I have to assess the value of the property accurately. I've done that. But how much goes to the building? Well, let's say 99% is the value of the building. But this is like prime central real estate in the middle of town. Yeah, it's all the building. You know what I mean? No land taxes needed here. Mr. Rich Guy is exempt. But your little farm, Mrs. Adorable median taxpayer, oh, yeah, 100% of that is the land, so pay up. So that's what, like, people are concerned about, is it gives basically this degree of freedom to bureaucrats to basically be corrupt, right? So even if there's a correct value that, like, an ardent ideological Georgist could apply to everything that would be correct and fair, they're afraid that basically it's going to invite corruption. And so let me answer the first question about corruption and incentives, right? Any system where you are assessing anything could be corrupt. So saying that there's an incentive for corruption is basically saying that you have a government, and it's a fully general critique against anything, including income and sales taxes and all the other taxes that we already have with their rafts of exemptions and loopholes and all these other things. And so you have to also prove why this criticism is any better or any worse than the status quo. And so to that end, I will point out that there are better and worse ways to administer property tax or land value tax regimes. And I'll give you an example of one that I think is slightly better than the status quo, which is the Texas Central Appraisal District system, which I don't think is perfect, but I think it's better than the regimes I've seen in some other states. And I'll describe it very briefly. In the 70s, property taxes in Texas were a mess. And just for background, in Texas, like, everything is property taxes because Texas is such an ardently anti-tax state. There's like several clauses in the state constitution that basically ban income taxes on the state level. So there'll never be income taxes in Texas. And so basically you're just left with sales taxes and property taxes, which means, like, property taxes just fund schools and fire and police and everything. And so even though, like, the state GOP's, like, party platform is to abolish property taxes, it's never going to happen because that means, like, literally defunding the police, and nobody wants to do that. So the Texas Central Appraisal District system is this kind of unique way of insulating the people who set the property tax values from the chicanery of people who want to raise money for their local government budgets, and kind of keeping those jobs very separate with kind of a Chinese firewall. And that's because in the 70s in Texas, property taxes were a mess because every local government unit And by what's a local government unit? A school district is a local government. A city is a local government. A county is a local government. And even if their boundaries overlap, they're still independent, sovereign local governments. And so each of these was like appraising your value separately and taxing you separately. So you might get like 3 or 4 opinions about what your house is worth in 4 different tax bills. And it was just a mess. It was ugly. And so they set up the Central Appraisal District. So some other states will, and so the Central Appraisal District, what it will do is it's a fully independent local government unit, just like a school district and just like a county government or a city government. But its only job is to appraise values. Note, I said appraise values. I didn't say assess taxes. Some people call them assessors, and then they will correct you and say they are appraisers, because all they do is appraise the value in their jurisdiction and send it to their taxing agents, taxing entities, which means the school district, the county, the city, the whatever, right? And they'll say, here are the values. Now, what's interesting about this is that they don't care about revenue. They don't care about tax rates. They don't set tax rates. The appraisal district just sets appraised values. Now, the city, the state, the city, the county, the school district, they will then decide how much money they're going to raise. And then they will work backwards from the value of all the real estate in their jurisdiction to set what's called the millage rate. Millage is just percentage, but thousands instead of hundreds. It's confusing, I know. And so this creates a fun situation where basically the appraisal district becomes the whipping boy of local government. Everyone's like, oh, that appraisal district, that mean old appraisal district, they raised all your values in accordance with what the market's doing. I guess we have to raise our taxes. And it's like, dude, if all the values went up by double and you kept your budget the same as last year, the tax rate would halve. There's no reason you have to raise taxes, you know? And so like whenever people are talking about appraisal caps and stuff like that, I'm like, well, you really want our budget caps. Because it's not the appraisal district's fault that taxes are going up. It's the governments that are choosing to raise more revenue.
So when we think about these appraisal districts, though, how are they actually determining the values? Because again, we're at that problem of it seems very, very difficult, or at least from a naive standpoint, trying to pin a value on every property in Texas seems like a monstrously hard problem.
Well, yeah, so there's real estate appraisal and there's valuing the land. So I've addressed half the issue of just how do you insulate the job of setting values from the incentive to raise values just because you want to increase taxes, right? So I think they're pretty well politically insulated, but now let's get into the technical details of how they actually appraise values. So first of all, the first part is that if you're just appraising values based off of market value of total real estate value, we Georgists are really interested in moving towards what we call land first modeling. A lot of appraisers, private and municipal, have this kind of approach that when they value a house, they kind of see it as a house first and not as a house at a location, a house on a piece of land. And the traditional methods for appraisal, I can just give you a really quick high-level methodology. There's the cost approach, there's the market sales comparison approach, and there's the income approach, are kind of the 3 biggies. So the cost approach is basically, you know how there's Kelley Blue Book for cars? Or there's a similar thing called Marshall and Swift for buildings. It's like, okay, vinyl siding, this much square footage, it's this old, it's made out of these materials. Okay, this is how much it costs to build new, and then you apply depreciation based off of its age and how much renovation it's had, and here's a value, right? And that gets you the value of the improvements, let's say. I have some quibbles with the cost approach. It's not the worst way to do it, but that's only going to give you the value of the improvements, and I think it tends to, and also cost is not price. That's just what it costs to build times depreciation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what it's going to sell for. Price is based on supply and demand, not necessarily what you paid to create this thing. But anyway, it's a decent enough thing to get at the value of the improvements. If you want to get at the value of the total property, though, you need to generally use the market sales comparison approach, which is that you look up comps, right? You get sales from other properties that have sold in the area, and you compare them. And, you make accounting for differences. Traditionally, this is done kind of by hand, with like adjustments and tables that people figure out. In the modern era, what you're supposed to do is use statistical methods, multiple regression, geographic weighted regression, where you build actual computational models that feed in all these observed price changes and all their characteristics, and then factor out the individual contribution to price value based off of these characteristics. And then the third method, which is mostly...
Just to jump in there, this is basically what you're saying is a comparison model would be like, let's look at, there was an actual plot of empty land that was sold in a particular city, let's say Miami, and then 2 blocks away, there's a similar sized plot of land, but that one has a house on it, and that sold for a different amount of money. And so we can do some statistical modeling, subtraction, I guess, is the simplest statistical model, is just subtract them. And, well, if this one sold for more, it must be the value of the house is that difference. And then I suppose you can do things like, is the house bigger or smaller, made out of certain materials? Is it close to the ocean? Is it blah, blah, blah? And you're saying there's statistical models that will let you determine how much of it is actually the house and the buildings and how much of it is the underlying land.
Right. So the thing is basically like imagine if you had, like in California, in San Francisco, you can easily find an example of an empty lot worth, $1.5 million next to a townhome that's worth slightly more, and it's like probably, most of the value there is the dirt. Right. And if you imagine 3 houses right next to each other on the same block, same size lots, same shaped lots right next to each other. One is, 4,000 square feet of built property. One's 2,000 square feet and one's 0 because it's just an empty lot. You can get a statistical signal out there of what the underlying land value is worth. There's the formal name for that is paired sales analysis. And what this is that basically you can do it over space or over time. So let me give you examples of what I mean. So over space, if you can find 2 different properties that are basically identical, but in different locations, and you can find not just pairs of those, but like clusters of those, especially with as much cookie cutter construction as we have these days, you can tend to find, basically, you can tease out locational premiums, right? Because like the exact same house, same amount of age and depreciation here versus here. A good example is just like there's a bungalow, like an extreme example is like, here's a small bungalow in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and here's one in San Francisco Bay. And lo and behold, in San Francisco Bay, it's worth millions. And in nowhere, Texas, it's only worth, tens of thousands. You can tease out that locational premium. Within a jurisdiction, the values are going to tend to be smaller. But you do tend to see effects like waterfront property is worth a lot more than mere water view property, which is worth a lot more than property that can neither see nor be on the water. Land that's on a golf course trades at a premium. Land that is, close to the country club trades at a premium. Land that's in a good school district tends to trade at a premium, and there's all these little land characteristics that you can feed into a model and that you can get a pretty good signal from independently and tell that they're adding to the land value when you feed them into these statistical models. But what really matters is you can have all the science and computers you want. Ultimately, you don't need to please the economists online. What you really need to please is like regular, normal people. And they're both easier and harder to convince than terminally online academics in the comment section that are complaining about how are you going to value Disneyland or whatever. What actually matters is you need to show them on a map that you're valuing them in a manner that's consistent to their neighbors, that you're not valuing their land higher or lower than any other neighbors, that you've got some kind of standard model that's fair, that's transparent, and that you can explain in non-academic language. That's what actually matters in the real world. Online, I get a lot of reply guys that are like, if you can't explain it to me, a 140 IQ economist, then you'll never get this in the real world. It's like, actually, dude, you're the last person I need to convince. What I need to convince is just like a regular salt of the earth, like mother of 3 who like is worried about her property taxes. right? I need to be able to I need to be able to explain it to like a city councilman or a city councilwoman, just like a regular normal person who doesn't give a flip about any kind of economic argument at all. That's the actual institutional barrier.
All right, so we're coming up on time now, and I want to ask the traditional final question that I ask to everybody who comes on this podcast, and that is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more? I will start out by recommending a beautiful book that Lars wrote called Land is a Big Deal. It's kind of the one-stop shop for why you should care about Georgism. Maybe you'll be convinced by it, maybe you won't. It's worth reading if you're curious about the arguments for Georgism and for land value taxes. So that's Land is a Big Deal. I'm happy to shill for that for you on your behalf, Lars.
Appreciate
it. Other than your own book, what else would you recommend for people who are curious, for people who want to learn more about land value taxes or Georgism in general? And this could be blogs, books, articles, just anything you think would be valuable.
Okay, well, let me see. So we have there's a Substack that I am a very, very, very minor contributor to called Progress and Poverty. So I think it's progressandpoverty.substack.com. And so there's a bunch of other writers who write on that, and that's a very good source. If you're interested in mass appraisal research of real estate, we, ValueBase at valuebase.co/podcast, we do a mass appraisal podcast. I'm an infrequent guest on that. It's mostly us interviewing people, who are actually in the business of mass appraisal in the industry. Other places you could go would be, there's a couple of people who have done some good videos on YouTube about Georgism. I would say Strong Towns and Not Just Bikes and anyone in the YIMBY movement. We have some allies there. I would also recommend Stephen Hoskin's articles, Land and Liberty to Build, among them, I think is a really good kind of primer on things. And there's let's see what else. The story of Monopoly and Lizzie Magie, I think, is really interesting because Lizzie Magie was a Georgist who invented the board game that eventually became Monopoly. PBS, was it PBS or NPR that had a documentary on her? That was a good introduction to that story. Those are kind of the things I would recommend.
All right. Well, it's certainly a pretty extensive list. It's always surprising and potentially encouraging to me, I guess, how extensive kind of the Georgist network of thought is. And I will say, having talked with you and Chris England and read up for the last month to kind of do these episodes, I don't know, maybe I'm a minor Georgist now. I don't think I'm all the way in the totalizing way that a lot of people are Georgists, but I would say I'm at least partially a Georgist at this point. So
I would say the nice thing about Georgism is it's not one of those totalizing philosophies like Marxism or whatever. That
it used to be at the very least. It used to be, Henry George would give speeches about how the land value tax would end war and cure disease and name anything wrong with society. It'll stop babies from dying, and maybe he went a little overboard, but it's got that totalizing instinct in it.
Well, what I mean by totalizing is in terms of basically setting limits on who's allowed to join the coalition, right? So doctrinaire Marxism requires that you be a materialist, and has always been a problem for, say, religious people, right? And then certain kinds of capitalism have their own problem with people who are kind of nervous about some of sort of the inflections and things that are demanded of it. Georgism can meet you where you are, whether you're on the left or the right, you can have a little Georgism as a treat, even if you don't think it's going to solve every problem in the world. And we don't necessarily make other demands of your identity. We just think that it's important that we share the earth and we share its resources and bounties so that we can get back to arguing about everything else.
Well, that sounds like a beautiful future to live in, where we're all arguing about different things than the things we argue about now. I want to thank my guest one more time, the author of Land is a Big Deal, Lars Doucet. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Lars.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
That's the episode. Thanks for listening. And if you have any comments, questions, want to argue with us or with a guest, send us a note at mailbag@cnliberalism.org. That's mailbag@cnliberalism.org. As always, we appreciate you listening, and we'll catch you at the next one.